So next Wednesday, Sir Michael Philip Jagger will incredibly reach the ripe old age of 80. As a founding member of the Rolling Stones in the early 1960s, he's seen as a global icon and one of the most influential frontmen in the history of rock music. He's gained notoriety for his romantic involvements, illicit drug use, and has often been portrayed as a countercultural figure.
Mick Jagger's Mick Jagger, the best frontman in the business. I mean, he'd get up there and do his stuff and lay it on you, and he means it. What you see is what you get. He's really a very honourable man.
There's a way of speaking and a way of talking about life and a way of being sexually roundabout, but sexually kind of provocative.
Mick went, "Hello, Lulu." I was frightened. I was afraid of him. All that sexual image that oozed, it was scary.
I mean, I'm lucky I still can sing more or less like the same notes when I was 19, but I haven't got a great voice, but it's okay. It does its job.
I don't think people even think that Mick has a beautiful voice. It's just Mick Jagger.
So I want to try to find out what Mick Jagger is really like and what drives him. My special guest is eminent music journalist, author and broadcaster Paul Sexton. He's interviewed Mick Jagger at least 20 times and seen the Stones play live around 15 times. So Paul, welcome. How are you?
Hello, Mike. I'm really good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, you're a journalist, but how would you describe your relationship with the Stones and their music? A fan, a big fan, a super fan?
A big fan, and not as super as some of the super fans that I've come across, especially in recent times, because there are some serious people out there, you know, who go to pretty much every gig and who collect everything. But so maybe not in that category, but it's one of those appreciations that's built up over a long period of time, actually, and not just from interviewing the whole of the band so often. I think that appreciation would definitely have been there anyway, you know. But you know that old cliche about people in decades gone by either grew up in a Stones household or a Beatles household. And the irony is that ours was very much a Beatles household. So the Stones was kind of a later thing for me. Still have older sisters who were complete Beatles obsessives. So it was a while before any Stones got into the house, I think. But, you know, I made up for lost time. I don't really remember the Stones that early, so it would have been the last couple of years of the 60s. And then once you get into the early 70s, I distinctly remember Brown Sugar coming out, and it was much more of a gradual sort of awareness of the Stones in my case.
So what was it that you found so appealing? What is it you find so appealing still?
I think that the reasons that I appreciate them so much now, a lot of them are the same, as was the case, you know, when I was really young. And then there are other reasons why you appreciate a band who've kept going for this long. Opinions will always differ about this. You know, they're certainly among the complete sort of front runners in terms of global figureheads for rock music. And, you know, you wouldn't put the Beatles in the same category as that because they weren't really what you would term a rock band, I think. For me, their only rivals for that title would be The Who. And also thinking about the fact that I would have come into being aware of the Stones when, in retrospect, we now know they were in the middle of that run of incredible albums from 68 to 72.
More music from the Rolling Stones here on BBC Three Counties Radio, because Sir Mick Jagger will be 80 this coming Wednesday. And my guest is Paul Sexton, and Paul's book that came out last year, excellent book, Charlie's Good Tonight, the authorised biography of the Stones drummer Charlie Watts. So some commentators in the 60s thought that rock and roll wouldn't last, and some musicians lived life fast and they sadly died young. You quote The Who, and of course, hope I die before I get old from my generation. What do you think of Mick Jagger reaching 80 then?
I think good on him. You know, I mean, the thing about Mick is he is never going to act his age. He's never going to appear his age. You know, he's eternally youthful. Some people are suspicious of that, but he just defies all medical science, I think. And having seen them a couple of times on the tour last year, the 60th anniversary tour, you know, and people who didn't see them were rather sort of skeptical about this, but he is still a phenomenon on stage, you know, and he still moves like Jagger, you know. Should be a song about that, shouldn't there? He moves like a man of, I would say, 20 years younger. And he'll be celebrating in private, but I don't imagine he will spend a great deal of time looking at all and reading and listening to all of the million tributes to him as he hits this supposedly grand young age, I would say. So
you have spoken to him about the ageing process and about getting old?
It's one of those things, we probably don't talk about it directly, but it is fascinating talking to Mick. It's a contradiction in some ways, because many people will remember that he actually did start writing his autobiography a long time ago, I think in the 80s. He signed a big deal for it. He started it. In fact, I'm led to believe that some of what he wrote does still exist, but he soon gave up on it because he ended up giving the advance back because he didn't enjoy the process of looking back. And I think that's one of the things that does define Mick. He is always looking for the next thing, whether that's within the Stones or in the many other things that he does in film or his own recordings and collaborations. So in that sense, he doesn't spend hardly any time, I think, looking back. The thing that kind of contradicts that a bit is the amount of time that he has spent being very dedicated to all of the many Stones reissues of the last 10 or 15 years, starting pretty much with the deluxe reissue of the Exile on Main Street album, which came out again in 2010. And Mick was very, very closely involved in overseeing that, as he is with all Stones projects, and even re-recording some things, for the bonus, the unreleased tracks that came out. And he's done that with, a succession of those reissues, including Some Girls, and most recent one was Goat's Head Soup. And they're great packages, and he oversees those. So from that point of view, he actually is spending a lot of time looking over his shoulder to when he was young. He's obviously okay with that, and wants, I think, the most important thing for him there is to be presenting this pretty amazing material to potentially to a new audience.
On the main, on the mountain.
It's BBC Three Counties Radio. We're talking about some Mick Jagger, and my guest is music journalist, author and broadcaster Paul Sexton. So you've interviewed him around 20 times. What's he like?
It's a buzz. It's a real thrill, as it is with all of them.
Does he have a different persona in front of the camera and microphone?
To some extent he does, yeah. I guess you would say more low-key, quite business-like a lot of the time. But, he can be very generous, and he certainly was when I was writing the book on Charlie, as all the Stones were. They were very generous with their time, and in Mick and Keith's cases, I was able to use some of that material for forwards by the pair of them, separate forwards. And Mick in particular was extremely engaged with that. He and I worked quite closely together on exactly what he wanted to say for that. And I think because in that case, more than any others, and I've interviewed them for some, fairly high-profile things, whether it's BBC Radio 2 documentaries or pieces for national newspapers, and often for material that will be used, by the record company to promote whatever the release is. But he's engaged with that, but was particularly engaged with the whole process of talking about his mate, basically, as they all were.
So do you feel that you really know him and his personality and character?
The boring answer to that is probably no, because I think, doing what I do, I've been so lucky to have been allowed into their world for a very long time. And again, that's another one of those very gradual processes where you just realize that you're getting asked back each time, and I do remember the point came when I had done that a few times where people started to say, oh, you must be mates now. And I was sort of thinking, no, not really. It's not how it works, but it's not really what you would call a social thing. But the fun, of course, is when you do get to hang out or you go backstage or onto the first night of a tour or whatever, and you do see interesting sides to their characters. And then maybe part of being asked back is being discreet, and just knowing what to report and what not.
Does he want to be loved all the time, indicating a little bit of insecurity?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And, I think that's part of why they're still doing what they do as the years have gone by. And I was going to allude to this in terms of, the appreciation of the Stones. Much as they're there to be knocked down for being still out there doing this at this stage in the game, I actually think there's something quite admirable about that, the fact that they are still out there and able to do it and still do it to an extremely high standard. And I think they're pretty good editors. I think they will know when that is no longer the case. But you can't deny that, when you're doing this kind of a job to that sort of a level, on the dimensions that they do it on in these enormous shows and so on, I'm sure that must be really quite addictive. It's one of those things that would be very hard to give up. So yes, there probably is that part of his character that's become kind of built in.
Keith Richards, in a documentary last year, said that Mick Jagger is a very honourable man.
Yeah, I would go along with that. He certainly is. I have close friends that are also his close friends, and I think that's a good description. He can be very vulnerable. There is a misconception that someone, like all major rock stars, I suppose, that they're sort of not quite human in some way, but he certainly is. And as we know, he's suffered some tragedies in his personal life, and suffered is the word, like anybody else would. But I think he remains, for me, quite a noble figure.
I said the joint was rocking.
massive stamina and energy needed on stage by Mick Jagger, the frontman, the world's greatest showman, it has to be said, I guess.
Yeah.
Is he naturally very fit, or did he have an amazing fitness guru that he followed and a fitness regime that still until last year on their 60th anniversary tour, he underwent and pursued?
Yeah, I think it's both of those things, really. I mean, he is naturally fit. He is, those lucky people that are still pretty much almost the same waist size as he was when he was in his 20s, which is extremely annoying for most of us. But yeah, he did come to the point where he wanted to start working with personal trainers and so on, and there's no doubt that that's been a huge influence on him still being able to do it at the level that he does it. He is very disciplined as a person in lots of ways, and that's not all as glamorous as people make out. You mentioned the traveling, and I think it doesn't matter how much luxury you travel in, you're still schlepping around from A to B to C to D to E, and that went on and on these tours for so long that I think all of them eventually ended up sort of pining for home. Charlie certainly did, but it's fascinating that within a couple of, well, in many cases, even less than a couple of years, sometimes only the following year, they'd be back out again. As we know, in more recent times, they pursued a much more sensible kind of touring schedule, as with the anniversary tour last year.
What was that like? Were they just as good as a band? Of course, Charlie had passed on, and so he wasn't drumming.
It was very strange. I was just finishing the book on Charlie Watts at that point, and the deadline allowed me, some people would say conveniently, but I had the chance to go and see the first night of that tour in Madrid. Listeners will remember, they came and did the UK shows, including the two at Hyde Park, and I saw the first one of those as well. That first night in Madrid, it was as exhilarating as ever. There's just something undeniable about the Stones as a live force. And that doesn't mean that they weren't rough around the edges. They certainly were. And it was very strange looking at the back and seeing someone other than Charlie Watts in the drum seat. But you have to say Steve Jordan is a brilliant choice as his successor. We thought temporarily at first, and then it's turned out to be permanent. He had Charlie's blessing. He had all the band's blessing. He works very closely with Mick and the others. Yeah, I would say, comparing that to the first time I saw them, okay, maybe down a few percent, but still way up there, among the greats of rock spectacles.
I met a gentle ballroom queen.
So Mick Jagger was born in 1942 in Dartford in Kent. His father was a gymnast and physical education teacher, and his mother a hairdresser. He always sang as a child. He was in a church choir. He left school in 1961 with 7 O-levels and 2 A-levels, and he studied finance and accounting at the London School of Economics, hoping to become either a journalist or a politician. And in the mid-50s, he formed a band with his friend Dick Taylor, playing songs by the likes of Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard and Howlin' Wolf. The Stones formed because of a lot of help from a blues man called Alexis Korner.
Yeah, that's right. Alexis is forever this hugely important figure in the Stones' early story, and not just the Stones, but so many other of that generation of British R&B fans, blues fans that were coming through in that great sort of explosion in the early 60s. But it's funny to look back and realise that at that stage, you compare the young Mick, or Mike Jagger, as he was still often called in those days, to the super confident rock frontman that we came to know in later years. And back in his early, I guess we're talking about, he's around 20 years old or thereabouts, he's still a little unsure of himself in terms of being at the front of a band like this. And the Stones in their early years, it wasn't Mick's band, it wasn't Keith's band, it was Brian's band, Brian Jones's band.
But the early black and white film footage that I've seen shows that even pretty early on, they were a really tight band. Yeah. They must have rehearsed so much and worked so hard to make it that way.
Yeah, they did. Much as, from the point where they played that famous first gig at the Marquee in July of 62, the band was not fully formed at that stage. But in many ways, they hit the ground running. They came into that scene sort of as a replacement for another band on that particular occasion. And they worked their way up. That's what happened in those days. And it doesn't really happen anymore, except with very few exceptions, of course. But, he was just a part of this fast rising band. Took a while to get going, as we know. It was a little while before they really began to get regular work. Charlie famously resisted joining for a little while because he was himself very much in demand on that rhythm and blues circuit. Plus, of course, he was pursuing what he thought would be his day job as a graphic designer and making some decent money there. So, the famous thing was the conversation which Keith recounted to me recently for the book of them trying to get Charlie and him saying, well, you've only got 1 gig a week. I can't afford to join. And it wasn't until they got a second regular one that he went, okay, I'll give it a try, thinking it would last for, 3 months or something. Little did he know.
One of my big jobs is to be a big show-off, really. That's really what it is. I suppose that's my job, for 2 hours to make people feel good. to bring people a joyous experience that have a great evening. And that's what I think my role is.
To become a really good frontman, Mick Jagger watched a lot of Little Richard, didn't he? And he went to see other performers on the TV show Ready, Steady, Go to see what other singers did and to study the camera angles. And Tina Turner and P.P. Arnold also helped him with his stage moves, I think.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and he's such an intelligent man that he's able to assimilate all of that sort of information very, very quickly and cleverly. And the other great influence on him visually, I think, and as a frontman, as a performer, was James Brown. And I do remember a great conversation we had one time. Again, I was making a Radio 2 documentary about James Brown, and I managed to get Mick. I think the Stones were on tour at that time, but I managed to get him. It was in the days when you could still do phone interviews for those sort of programs. And he was absolutely fascinating on that subject, you know. And again, sometimes the best conversations with artists are when they're not talking about themselves, when you get onto a different subject. And I think it's probably quite refreshing for them too, to be a little bit sort of off piece, off script. And he talked a lot and very enthusiastically about the influence of James Brown, and told me actually at that point, it was a while ago now, but he said to me that he would often still, probably on that tour when we were talking, that he would often play the famous James Brown live album, Live at the Apollo, just before he'd go on stage to get himself in the mood for what was to come. So that's the sort of level of influence. And you're right, Little Richard and one or two others from that sort of early period that he would have listened to as a kid.
In common with a lot of early 60s British bands, the Rolling Stones covered American songs at first, so their first hits were Chuck Berry's Come On, I Want to Be Your Man, written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Buddy Holly's Not Fade Away, It's All Over Now by Bobby and Shirley Womack, and Little Red Rooster by Howlin' Wolf. But manager Andrew Loog Oldham told them they needed to start writing their own songs, like the Beatles and the Hollies. Is it true that he locked them in a room and said, don't come out until you've got some songs?
I'd love to say yes, but I don't think it actually happened that way. I mean, it's any number of urban myths about those early days of the Stones, as there are with other bands, but he certainly did force their hand. Andrew, who I've been lucky enough to know, I remember meeting him a long time ago, 15 or more years ago, at an event in America, and we got on and stayed in touch. And fascinatingly, you know, he was their contemporary. Andrew's the same age as Mick and Keith, pretty much, and yet he exerted this great sort of authority and wisdom and knowledge beyond his years. And he always saw the bigger picture, and that bigger picture was that they could not go on, you know, as they had been successfully, but in a very limited capacity, just covering other people's work. And in the same way that John and Paul developed and exploded as songwriters, of course, as we now know, so did Mick and Keith, and it was largely at the instigation of Andrew Loog Oldham. Yeah.
There's this pool and there's this motel in Clearwater, Florida, and I remember sitting with Keith and writing his song Satisfaction. Andrew Oldham said, "This is like a #1 single, this is great." Keith was like, "Oh, I don't really like it, can't come out as a single." And it went to #1 like instantly. It was like a big moment. You know, it became your signature tune, your cri de coeur, your sexuality, your controversy. You need to have that song that everyone remembers.
They just clicked, and it wasn't always just R&B, but blues, a couple of country songs, softer ballads as well, like Lady Jane.
That's right, yeah. And Lady Jane, I always hold up as another one of those early examples. People always go on about Satisfaction as being the, you know, that one that you mentioned from the locked room or whatever. And clearly that's a massively important staging post for the band. But, you know, Lady Jane and others from, I suppose, 65 were equally important and showed their versatility. That has almost a sort of like classical undertones to it in a way, that song. It's always been a favourite.
My sweet Lady Jane.
BBC Three Counties Radio. We're talking to Paul Sexton about Mick Jagger ahead of his 80th birthday this coming Wednesday. Now, Andrew Loog Oldham, was he crafting an image of the Stones as well? Because while the Beatles were seen as cuddly mop-tops, the Stones he wanted to portray as something different, and he sort of suggested they were wild and rebellious, right? That was something that he imposed on them?
Yeah, that's right. And that part of it is definitely true. You know, he saw the opportunity for the Stones to be the sort of anti-Beatles, I suppose you'd say. Although the irony of that, of course, is that they were always great mates. Anyone who's got the idea that they were rivals has got it wrong, because the British pop scene at that time, before they all started travelling, really, there was quite small, and they would literally bump into each other. That's exactly why the Stones were given I Want to Be Your Man as their second single by John and Paul. They literally bumped into each other on the street, and that's how that conversation developed. They were friends, but Andrew was smart enough to realise that there was probably a mutual benefit, actually, in casting them as the very opposite of the Beatles. And some of that was contrived, but they lived up to it, put it that way. And I think you could say it served them pretty well.
Andrew wanted us to be more nasty and more dirty, more of an edge, which is a very good sell. And it wasn't difficult for us to do, because at that age, it's quite easy to have that edge.
Yeah, then, of course, they ran into a little bit of trouble. There was that famous drugs bust at Keith Richards' house, Redlands in Sussex, with the police being tipped off by the News of the World. Mick Jagger was originally given a prison sentence, but he was got off by the establishment after a campaign led by the editor of The Times, William Rees-Mogg. Then, of course, we had the death of Brian Jones. So it's been suggested that Jagger bullied him and cut him off because of Jones's increasing use of drugs. That made things worse. And then people were stabbed and died at a free concert in Altamont, San Francisco. So suddenly it seemed that it wasn't all going so well.
No, and it's funny how a lot of this really bad stuff was happening to the Stones just as the decade was ending, and we'd gone through that period of great hope, hadn't we? The summer of love in 67, and then you take it as far ahead as Woodstock, I guess, in the summer of 69. And then almost immediately after that, as you mentioned, you have that terrible tragedy at Altamont, Brian's death around the same time. I think to address that specifically, the thing with that, and it's a very sad thing to recount, and some people will have seen the recent TV documentary about Brian, he was really his own worst enemy in so many ways. I mean, much as things got so bad that there was the band meeting and they agreed that he could no longer be in the group. And of course, he died soon afterwards. So they all felt genuinely wretched about that. It was a terrible time for the band. But even Charlie, who was about, as mild-mannered as anyone has ever been in rock and roll, even he admitted to me and to everyone that Brian was really out of control. And not just recently, it was in the previous couple of years, because he was just unreliable. And, however hedonistic their lifestyle may have appeared to be, the thing about the Stones is that they've always been, for the very most part of the time, super professional, and it is at odds with the image that they cultivated, but they've hardly ever missed a show. They're right on it and I've been lucky to see them in rehearsals on many occasions, and they're a working band, and that's how it works. And it wasn't working with Brian, so that's why that sadly played out the way it did.
I've been holding out so long, I've been sleeping all
Around about this time as well, Mick Jagger has admitted that the band hadn't made any money. They owed a lot of tax. They had to record abroad in France to avoid paying high tax here. So Mick Jagger, the businessman, took control. They launched their own record label with that famous logo of a big tongue. And then the first album that came out was Sticky Fingers, and a whole run of really amazing albums. Exile on Main Street, Ghosthead Soup, Black and Blue. So I guess, maybe those days of studying a little bit of accountancy at the LSE, he did take control, and he wanted to get the band back on a firm financial footing, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And once you get into that period of the early 70s, they enjoyed themselves in different ways, and Mick included, as he would later admit quite readily. But you're right, they were pretty much broke at that point, where they were very much encouraged by the money men to leave the country. We shouldn't forget that the run of great albums had started well before that with Beggars Banquet and Let It Bleed, still in the Alan Klein era. But by the time they got to 71, it was kind of a new dawn in a lot of ways. It was leave the country, form a new record label, and a whole new world of opportunity, really. They didn't know that at the time. It was all very uncertain. Once again, it was like, how on earth have we arrived at this situation? But I think you're right. By this time, Mick was beginning to show his business nous in ways that perhaps the others didn't do so much. And it certainly wasn't only Mick's doing, but the commissioning of that logo turned out to be probably the single most important business decision that any band has ever made, I think, because there had never really been a logo for a rock band before. And here we are, 50 plus years later, still seeing it on T-shirts worn by young people who weren't even born at that point every day.
I try to do things that haven't been done before or difficult to do, but I don't honestly enjoy doing business per se very much. I'd much rather be a performer, and I wish I didn't have to do any of the businesses, but I am interested in creating shows.
Bigger tours with bigger stages in bigger stadium, grossing bigger and massive amounts of money, zillions from the live shows.
Yeah.
But you still think they were concerned with making new and good music rather than with just making money?
Yes, I think, if you think of the 70s as being the period when it expands, as you described there, certainly you'd look at an album like Some Girls in 78 as being still a classic Stones album. And then opinion does begin to divide, as you go into the 80s. You've got people who are still big fans of albums like Tattoo You, including myself. And perhaps it's fair to say that, the albums after that, while they still have great songs on them, they aren't perhaps as strong throughout as LPs. But yeah, the appetite for work was always there. You have to go into the mid-80s before there was a definite hiccup, to put it mildly, in the way that Mick and Keith began to fall out for quite badly. Charlie was not in a very good way. Keith was famously not in a good way. And, they did come very close to splitting, but they wisely, I think, decided to just go their separate ways for a while and came back very strongly in 89 with the Steel Wheels album. And that album and the tour that went with it, I think most people would say that's really the beginning of the modern day Rolling Stones, touring as they did in those days, where the tours would last up to 2 years, which is just insane, really. But that's the sort of level they were at, and playing on these enormous stadia and so on.
Yeah, if I could stick my hand in my heart.
In her book published last year, Stone Age, author Leslie Ann Jones claimed that despite the band creating the soundtrack to millions of our lives, the fallout from their hedonistic lifestyle has been immense. It has damaged and even destroyed many women, children and band associates. Do you think that has tainted his legacy, Mick?
I would have to give you my honest answer and say that no, I don't, actually. Obviously anyone who lives their life in the public eye to the extent that he does is going to be under immense scrutiny. That doesn't mean that the rules should be different for him than they are from anybody else. But no, I don't think I would go along with that point of view, much as there are obviously things in Mick's life and all of their lives that they would regret and wish they'd done very differently, I'm sure. But no, on balance, I think that's not a view I would hold with.
I don't think that I revel in the gossip and scandal and lies that they tell about you, and a lot of it is lies. I'm very hardened to it, and I think that's the only attitude. You don't want people to take you seriously, but you don't want to be just known for being a playboy or being with this girl or that girl or getting into trouble. I mean, because it's a very small part of your life, and they usually blow it up and to make it out to look like that's all you do.
What about his solo albums and his performances as an actor in several films? It was a bit of a surprise that his solo work never really was successful commercially.
Yeah, it was. That's right. And, he tried that from fairly early on. Some of your listeners will remember a single called Memo from Turner, which was from Ned Kelly, wasn't it? And it wasn't a hit, really. And he's tried several times. He has made some really good solo work, I think, and there are great tracks within those solo records. But he perhaps occasionally has been guilty of trying too hard to sound very different from the Stones, and it's understandable, whereas Keith's solo records, they have a different sort of spin on them to the Stones, but it's very much more in keeping with his sound and image within the band. Mick, I often think, has done his best work in collaborations, and one song in particular that stands out for me is one that he wrote with Dave Stewart for the soundtrack of the remake of the film Alfie, and I think it was 2004, which was quite a favourite of mine, and I think deserved to be a much bigger hit. Actually, it was a song called Old Habits Die Hard.
I thought I shook myself free.
So Paul Sexton has been my guest. He is a music journalist, writer and broadcaster, and his book about Charlie Watts, the authorised biography, is called Charlie's Good Tonight. How's the book gone down since it came out last year, Paul?
Gone really well, Mike. Modesty should prevent, but it appears to be travelling around. I think we're in 10 versions now, in maybe 8 or 9 languages. The publishers, HarperCollins, were good enough to send me some of those international editions the other day, and that's quite bizarre, to see of the paperback in all of its different formats. It's lovely to see the reaction to it, and I keep saying it's all about Charlie and people's love of him, and people talking about him as when he died. It's like they were mourning a member of the family or a friend or something. And so, yes, I keep saying he's still on tour.
So what next? As Mick Jagger turns 80, will we ever see Mick and the Stones perform live again, or record some new material and continue to songwrite?
Yeah. I mean, my lips are somewhat sealed on some of this stuff, but I think it's fair to say yes to both of those questions, Mike. They're not done. That's fair to say. There is this feeling, Keith always talks about this. He, of all of them, just loves playing live so much, and he really would go on until he drops, I think. And because nobody else has ever done it for this long, and he was saying this to me 20 years ago, let's see how far it can go. You know, no one knows. And the way that they sing these songs, there is never a suggestion of them phoning it in or being bored with them. They're slightly different every night. There's all kinds of variables that can take place on stage. And, you know, Mick is the great master of fronting all of that, you know, in a way that I don't think we'll ever, you know, there's no way we'll ever see his like again.
Really great talking to you, Paul. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Mike. And
your prediction about maybe a new tour and new material to come.
What a tease, eh?
Wonder if we'll make it to 80.
Oh, God, let's not talk about that.
Well, we played 14 tracks in that last hour here on BBC Three Counties Radio by the Stones, 7 in full and 7 sort of in partially, and the penultimate one, Old Habits Die Hard, the female voice on that, along with Mick Jagger, was one Sheryl Crow. My grateful thanks to Paul Sexton for spending some time with us this afternoon. Brilliant to have him on the show, and his authorised biography of drummer Charlie Watts, Charlie's Good Tonight, is very thorough and detailed. Terrific read. And really, Charlie Watts was a very kind and generous man, a real family man. He was a collector of rare and old books, and he often gave them away as birthday presents as well.